Memorable privilege to have been with you this week, and especially tonight. You know, there's nothing more important than community music. You can be in a college chorus, and it looks good on your resume. You can sing in the church choir, and maybe that'll get you out of teaching Sunday school. But if you sing in a community chorus, you do it because of pure love of music, and pure love of the community in which you live. Never forget that the word amateur comes from the Latin word amo, which means to love. Amateurs are people who are paid in love because they do what they do out of love. And there's no finer label that can be applied to us than to say, she does, he does what they do because they are a true amateur because of love. And thank you for that gift of love. I'm privileged to be on a team with you tonight. Thanks for being here. Now, if we were just going to read the Bible, and we picked it up and opened it up to the first chapter in Genesis, we already know where it starts, right? We'd start off in the first chapter reading that first story about the creation, about all the separation of the water and the firmament. And then we go on to the days of the sort of the second part of the creation. And then we get over to the third chapter eventually, and we come to the serpent in the Garden of Eden and that sad story of the fall. And then we keep going and we get over to the fourth chapter and we read about Cain and Abel. And now that we've plowed our way through all of that stuff, now we get to the good part. Chapter number 5. Are you ready? Hang on. When God created human beings, He made them in the likeness of God. He created them male and female and blessed them. And when they were created, He called them human beings. When Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth. After Seth was born, Adam lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Adam lived a total of 930 years, and then he died. When Seth had lived 105 years, he became the father of Enosh. After he became the father of Enosh, Seth lived 807 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Seth lived a total of 912 years, and then he died. When Enosh had lived 90 years, he became the father of Kenan. And after he became the father of Kenan, Enosh lived 815 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Enosh lived a total of 905 years, and then he died. How far do you want me to keep going? You know how it goes, don't you? So I'm just going to go all the way down to the last verse in the chapter. After Noah was 500 years old, he became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And may God bless whatever the reason is for our having read this. And be with us for the rest of this hour. Let us pray. O Lord, you have heard the words which we speak aloud. Hear now the words which we are afraid to say, both because we are uncertain about them, or because we ourselves do not even know what they are. Open our ears to thy voice, and let us hear words of strength and redemption, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. I decided to read that little chapter part tonight. It could have been other chapters because, you know, there are a bunch like that. And if we grew up with the King James Version, you know, we call it the begats. They begat and they begat and they begat and they just kept begatting for a long time. And usually when we're reading through those early chapters of the Old Testament, those are the parts we skip over because we think that's not a story, that's just a list. But wait a minute. We need to stop and realize that for the people who lived in those times, those chapters were the most important parts. You see, they already knew the creation story. They could tell it to one another without reading anything. They already knew about Cain and Abel. They already knew about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. But you see, as soon as writing was developed, it was of utmost importance to write down the records of family. So the people from whom we came, who they were, their names, the barest memory of their lives would never, never, ever be forgotten. It's not a list. It's a family roll call. Do you know, to this very day, in spite of the season, in spite of the weather, in spite of whatever kind of sport is being played, doesn't matter. Every week of the year, one of the top 5 internet search sites every single week is Family Search, the LDS genealogical library, which enables people to try to locate their ancestors. And Ancestry.com is one of the fastest growing businesses on the internet. We're just the same, aren't we? We long to know who are the people from whom we came. How have they made us who we are? And we know deeply that we must not lose our heritage. It runs all through those pages of the Old Testament again and again. We have the genealogy that runs all the way from Adam down to Noah, and then from Noah down to Joseph. And then we split off into the tribes, and again we have all this. It's just like in our own family. We get together on Thanksgiving. We get together at Christmas, and you sit down after you've eaten and eaten and eaten and eaten and eaten, and then somebody starts to tell those stories. The ones that make you say, oh no, not that again. Oh, we've heard that so many times, don't tell that again. But if Grandpa dies and he's not there next year, the family gets together and the family doesn't say, oh boy, Grandpa's dead. We don't have to listen to that old mess anymore. Oh no. All of a sudden somebody says, remember that story Grandpa used to tell? And everybody goes, oh no, not that again. And then it's, tell it. Because the ones who know it, they must be the ones who belong in this family. And the ones who don't know it, they're aliens who slipped in for the chicken. Yeah. And if somebody brings a prospective son-in-law home, you know how the family tests him out. They put him at the table in the middle of those stories. Trap him right in the middle of all those stories. And if he goes to sleep, he is out of there. He is gone. But if he listens and acts like he's interested, he's voted in right on the spot because he's blessed the stories. There's nothing more important to us as families than holding on to all those stories. And now I'm going to tell you one. You ready? My grandfather, no greats to it, just my plain, ordinary grandfather, was born in 1850. It's hard for me to realize if my grandfather were alive, he would be 163 years old. He was born way, way back in the north end of Haywood County, not down in the bad end, and up in the north end. And he never got married till he was 30 years old because in that culture, you needed to have your own land and you needed to have built a house to prove you could take care of a family. And on December the 9th, 1880, when he turned 30 years old, he turned 30. The next day, he filed the deed for his own land, which he had actually bought from his grandfather. And on Christmas Eve, he got married to a woman named Nancy Jane Medford, who was 16 years old. He was 30, she was 16. They moved into the log house that he had built there in Haywood County, and the next year they had their first child, a little boy whose name was William. The following year they had their second child, a little boy whose name was Dare. He was a boy, but he was named for Virginia Dare, the first child of English parents, born here in North Carolina. The next year they had their third child, a little girl named Margaret, and their oldest child died of whooping cough, not yet 3 years old. The following year they had a fourth child whom they named Grover. It was the year of Grover Cleveland's election as president. And that same year their second child, not 3 years old, died of whooping cough. The next year they had a fifth child. They named her Flora. And their third child, not yet 3 years old, died of whooping cough. The next year there was no child, because the next year his wife died of whooping cough. She was 22 years old. She had borne 5 children and buried 3 of them. And when I first heard that story and I said to my daddy, what killed her, whooping cough? He said, maybe so. Maybe it was just old age. Well, my grandfather took those 2 surviving children, whom I remember as my Uncle Grover and my Aunt Flora, and he went back home, moved back in with his parents, where they took over the job of raising the children. And he lived there all together until they were teenagers. And then when he was 47 years old, he married my grandmother, and they proceeded to have 8 more children. Now the first 4 in that second family were boys. And in my whole growing up years, those 4 brothers, my daddy was number 3, they were totally inseparable, and they were the most important male influence on my entire life. The first one born in 1899 was my uncle, whose name was Lee Moody Davis, named for Robert E. Lee, and my grandmother, whose maiden name was Moody. The next year, his little brother was born, and he was named Faraday. Now, nobody could figure that name out. They'd never heard of such a name. Where did the name Faraday come from? Why did you hitch that on some poor little baby? But my granddaddy was in the legislature in Raleigh, and one of his buddies in the legislature, in fact, his roommate, they shared a room down in the hotel during the session, was a man named Mr. Faraday. And so when that new baby was born, he was named Faraday. Nobody liked the name. The next year, Granddaddy came back home from the Senate, walked in the door, looked at the baby playing on the floor, and said, "We'll call him Harry." And he was Harry for the rest of his life, simply renamed on the spot, informally. And it was weeks later before my grandmother learned that when Granddaddy had gone back down to Raleigh, he discovered that Mr. Faraday had turned Republican. And so he couldn't stand for the baby to have that name. He just had to give him a new name, Well, the next year, my daddy was born, and it was a strange thing because in that double family, he was actually the 8th child, but he was named for his father. Why did his father wait that long down the line to name a child for himself? And then the year after that, my daddy's little brother, Uncle Frank, was born, the one who from birth everybody in the family declared was in charge of bad ideas. Now, I loved those 4 men. I loved every moment, and none of them got married till they were up in their 40s. My dad didn't get married till he was 44, and see, 2 of them were older than he was. It was like having 4 grandfathers. Oh, I was just spoiled by them, and they loved each other, and I loved everything about every moment spent with them. Now, Uncle Harry and Uncle Moody didn't live in Haywood County. They lived in what today we would call Eden, but in those days it was Leaksville, Spray, and Draper. And so we would have to make a trip all the way down there to see them, and every time was, a great adventure. See, my Uncle Harry was a car dealer. He was a Chrysler Plymouth dealer. He had started out as an auto mechanic, and somewhere along the way he had cut the end of his finger off, and what he had there was a little piece of fingernail that looked like a little unpopped grain of popcorn. And every time, as soon as we'd get there, he'd say, "Look at my finger." "You want to know what happened to my finger?" And what do you think I'd say? Yes. And every single time, it was a totally different story. I heard about the time the game rooster pecked it off, about the time he closed it in the window and chopped it off, about the time he chopped it off in the fan blade of a car. I mean, about the time a shark in the Gulf of Mexico bit it off. If he had had 1,000 fingers, he'd have lost every one of them a different way. He liked to invent things, and even before I came along, he had built early in the 1950s, before I even remember it, he had built what he called his robot. It had a body made out of a metal trash can, legs made out of stovepipes, and arms out of stovepipes, a head out of a galvanized bucket. Its eyes were yellow bug lights, and its mouth was a radio speaker. And he could let it roll down the little slope right in front of his car dealership, and a little wire came all the way back into his office where he could look out the window and talk through a microphone, and it would come out of the robot. And as little kids would come down the street, they were amazed the robot knew their names. Robot knew their mamas and daddies, knew whose room they were in at school, knew how well they were doing when they had been in trouble. They just couldn't believe how smart that robot was. He'd finally have to pull it back inside so they'd go on home and wouldn't ask the robot to do their homework for them. Well, then we'd go on across town and we'd go visit my Uncle Moody. He was married to Aunt Rebecca. They had no children, but they lived in a neighborhood that was full of children. And since he had grown up on a farm, he thought it was his responsibility to educate the town children in rural ways. So one day when he was coming home from the wholesale grocery company, he stopped by the farm supply store and bought 2 bales of straw, and went by the A&P store and bought 2 glass quart bottles of milk. And then he went back in the edge of the woods behind his house, took the straw apart, and there on the ground, about 6 feet across, he built a big nest and put the bottles of milk in it. And as the children came down the street on the way home from school, he ran out and said, "Children, come quick, come quick. I found where a big cow built her nest in the woods. Come quick, let's go see if she laid some milk." And they went back to the woods, and sure enough, the cow had not only built her nest, she had laid 2 quarts of milk right in it. And every day the children would come to see if the cow had, one day the cow had laid chocolate milk. And a big debate arose about how that happened till one little boy popped up and said, "I know what, that's the kind she lays in the dark." And if that were not enough, in his front yard, he had a chewing gum tree. It looked kind of like a black locust, but in the springtime when it bloomed, from every little crack in the bark, out came a little rolled up stick of chewing gum. And the children could just walk up and bite chewing gum right off of that tree. Wouldn't you be fascinated by relatives like that? Well, my daddy was next in line, and he was just as interested as the rest of them. He worked at the bank in Waynesville, and when my mother didn't want me to go somewhere with her, like to the beauty parlor or the doctor's office, she would drop me off at the bank because she knew my daddy really didn't do anything. And the tellers at the bank were young women who had no children, and I was kind of their little play toy. They would give me a big adding machine, and they'd let me add up all the numbers in the Waynesville phone book. I'd have an adding machine tape that went all the way across the room, curled up the wall on the other side. So sometimes someone would come in the bank who had a little child with them, and my daddy would say, "Do you know that little kid?" I'd say, "Yes, they're in my room at school." He'd say, "You want to do it?" And I'd say, "Yes." And I would go up to that little kid and I would say, "Now, my daddy works here. Do you want to see where they keep the money?" And we would take them back in the big Mosler vault, back past the deposit boxes, back to bars in the back. And my daddy would point to big cloth bags that had coins in them and flat canvas cases of currency. And while that little kid was studying through the bars, we would sneak out, close the door, turn off the light, and listen to him scream and scream and scream and scream. And then we'd finally let him out, and he would say, "That's what we do to every robber who comes in this bank. So you better not be." There never was a robber in Waynesville. And all the parents were grateful because my daddy saved them from having the reputation of raising a child who turned out to be a bank robber. Yeah. And then there was that little brother, Uncle Frank, and oh, he was worse than all of them put together. I remember one day he came to our house and he had been to Guy Chambers' funeral. And when my daddy asked him to tell about the funeral, he couldn't stop laughing. And we had to find out what was so funny about a funeral. And then we heard the story about how they had opened the grave the night before, and in the night before the funeral came, a big fat skunk had fallen in the grave. And they could not figure out how to get the skunk out so they could put Guy in there, even though everybody who knew Guy said that he and the skunk would get along together just fine. Well, Uncle Frank finally convinced the gravedigger that in order to squirt you, a skunk has to lift up its tail, right? And it has enough muscles in its tail to lift up its tail. But if you pick it up by the tail, it doesn't have enough muscles in its tail to lift the weight of its whole body, so you've got it locked shut. And he explained that he would do the first part, but he had hurt his knee and he couldn't jump down in there. So he finally got the gravedigger to jump down in the grave, grab the skunk by the tail, hand it up to him, and he carried it off in the woods, and they went on with the funeral. And when my daddy said, "How did you know that would work?" he said, "I didn't. That's why I got him to jump down in there." Well, I thought those men were going to be around forever. I thought they would take care of me no matter what, that they would teach me everything wise I needed to know, and they would be a constant source of family stories always. When one day when I was in high school, the telephone rang, and my Uncle Harry had had a heart attack and died. He was only 59 years old. And we got in the car and made the trip down to Leakesville, and I remember sitting on the second row right behind my daddy and Uncle Frank and Uncle Moody, watching them as they said goodbye to their brother. It was a half dozen years later, and I was a college student, when the next call came from my mother telling me that out of nowhere, Uncle Moody had had a heart attack and died. And I met them up in Leakesville to sit there and watch my daddy and Uncle Frank, now half the brothers gone, say goodbye to Uncle Moody. It was only 2 years later when my mother called to tell me that my daddy's little brother, Uncle Frank, by now only 68 years old, had had a heart attack and died. And we made the trip home, and I sat there and watched my daddy sitting by himself. All three of his brothers gone, even his younger brother. watched him say goodbye to the last one. And so, see, it was almost no surprise when early on an April morning, the year after that, I was awakened by the phone. I reached down to pick it up out of sleep, and when I picked up the phone, do you have relatives who are so close that all you need to do is hear them say your name and you know who it is? And as soon as I heard someone say, Donald, it was my cousin Kay. That's all I needed to hear. Kay's mother was my mother's little sister, only 10 months apart in age, and kind of as a joke, she always called both of our mothers Mama. And she said, Donald, it's your daddy. He just didn't wake up this morning. I said, where's my mother? Kay said, they took him to the hospital anyway. She's still there, and I came back to call you. I said, we'll be there as soon as we can. I have to make phone calls to be away on Sunday. It's too early to call people right now, but as soon as we can and as soon as it's decent to leave, there were no cell phones. We had to deal with everything before we left. We'll be on the way. And then I walked from our room across the hall into the next bedroom where there asleep was our firstborn 4-week-old baby. And that's when it hit me. He would never, ever know his grandfather. And that's when it all came loose. Because here came pouring into my head all the questions which I would now never be able to answer. And the next 2 hours were haunting, because one thing after another, here they came. I was only 28 years old, not old enough to have enough sense to ask. And now I wouldn't be able to ask. And everything I wanted to know was at a dead end. Finally, we were ready to go, and we realized that if we had left when the call first came, we'd already be there. And I thought, well, we better call again and let them know we're just now leaving so nobody will be worried. And I didn't want to make the phone call. You see, here's one of the big differences between my parents. Whenever I would call home, I always wanted my daddy to answer the phone. The phone would ring 2 times, and then I would hear a voice go, "Hello, this is Joe Davis. It's a good day. What can I do for you?" But if it rang more than twice, I knew he wasn't going to answer it. And it would ring 4 or 5 times, and then a little voice would say, "Hello?" I'd say, "Hi, Mama. What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." "Why are you calling long distance?" "I just wanted to talk to you." "Are the boys sick?" "No, the boys aren't sick." "Do you need money?" "No, I don't need any money." And when I sat down to make that phone call, I knew he would never answer again. It would be her. Well, I dialed the number that had been ours since dials were invented. I held the phone, shaking. It rang twice, and all of a sudden a voice said, "Hello, this is Joe Davis. It's a wonderful day. What can I do for you?" And I dropped the telephone, scrambled around, got hold of it, and stupidly said, "You're supposed to be dead." And we began to try to figure out what in this world had happened. We made the trip home anyway. How could you do otherwise after that? Couldn't trust another phone call. Besides, we had already made all the plans to be gone. And we got there and had a wonderful time and began to discover it was the strangest of all coincidental circumstances. My cousin Kay had nothing to do with it. Less than a week before that, a young man named Donald Davis had moved to Lexington where we lived. His father's name was also Joe. His mother's name was also Lucille. His father had died. And since he had just moved, his sister called information to get his new phone number and was given our number. She also thought she was talking to the right person. Neither of us had any question in the world about that conversation. And the great mystery in their family was, I called him, why didn't he come? Well, my father lived 23 more years after that first time he died. To see 3 grandsons grow up all the way through high school. And every single thing that I have told you about him tonight, every single story I ever tell about him, I learned after the first time he died. Because then I knew to ask, and then he knew to tell. And the stories poured, and the questions poured. And my children to this day believe they knew my 3 uncles who died before they were born, because they have heard the stories so many times. Now you know why I'm telling you this, don't you? Because if we're sitting here alive tonight, we still have a chance. We have a chance to ask, and we have a chance to tell. I meet children in high school who have never heard a story about when their parents or grandparents were children. I meet children in high school who have no idea who their great-grandparents are. Somehow there's a genetic assumption that they know without being told. But here's the truth. Our grandchildren will somehow end up with a car whether we help them or not. Our grandchildren will end up with a computer whether we buy them one or not. Our grandchildren will end up with a place to live whether we help them or not. Our grandchildren will get enough education to get a job whether we ever help them or not. But they will never, ever learn the stories of the people from whom they have come if we do not tell them those stories. And right now, they may think it's as boring as begat, begat, begat. But the time will come when they will bless us for it and will know to pass those stories on themselves. There's only one rule of family storytelling. You ready to learn it? It doesn't matter if they want to hear it or not. Tell it anyway. Aren't we fortunate to have that model from the book of Genesis? And the next time you're reading along and you come to that long, long list, don't worry about the names in that list, but use it as a parable to remind us once again, it's not a list for us either. It's who we are, it's the people we've come from, and in the end, we're all God's people. Amen.